My name is Marian Sawer and I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of International Relations here at the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. It is my honor and pleasure to warmly welcome you all to this event as a representative of the ANU Gender Institute and as a contributing author to the exciting book that we are launching today. First, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting today on land traditionally owned and cared for by the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. I pay my respect and gratitude to their elders past and present. I also extend my respect and gratitude to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. This event is proudly supported by the ANU Gender Institute. The Institute is a cross-campus institute at the ANU with a dual mission to connect our ongoing work on gender and sexuality in research, education, and outreach. It is also tasked to promote innovative research and programs to help address gender inequalities at the ANU. It brings together gender expertise and community within the college and schools and campus. And so for those who are new to ANU or haven't done so, please consider signing up via the Institute website or chat to Tamara, who's in front, for more information. So now please allow me to introduce the book to you and later on to say a few words about the structure of our book launch today. The Handbook of Feminist Governance is edited by Marian Sawer, Emeritus Professor in the School of Politics and International Relations at ANU, Ann Banaszak, Professor in the Department of Political Science at the Pennsylvania State University, Jacqui, Professor of International Relations in the School of Social Sciences at Monash University, and last, Johanna Kantola, who is a Professor of European Politics at the University of Helsinki, Finland. The handbook defines the term governance to cover all processes of government, from the formal to the informal, from laws, institutional norms, and policy framing to networks and relationships through which authority is both exercised and held to account. By feminist, the book draws on organizational style evident in how women's movements created institutions explicitly designed in accordance with non-hierarchical principles and consensus decision-making. The feminist in feminist governance also means the adoption and implementation of institutions and policies directed towards achieving gender equality, an expression of feminist values, forms of consultation, and soft regulation through transnational monitoring. This fantastic volume aims to summarize and reflect upon feminist governance in a comprehensive way. It makes accessible knowledge to both scholars and practitioners. It presents the debates over feminist governance, the role of insiders and outsiders, transnational networks, autonomous women's movements, and international and regional norm transmission, as well as introducing state-of-the-art feminist governance expertise and toolkits. So the book begins with an introduction to key theoretical concepts and an international timeline of feminist governance. It also provides a comprehensive overview of feminist principles and practices in national, regional, and global settings. The chapters you will find cover a variety of timely issues, from quotas, gender budgeting, gender mainstreaming to institutional design, and of course, with the emergence of feminist foreign policy. Regional innovations is also featured with contributions from examining the EU, Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific. This wide-ranging handbook will definitely be an essential reference text for students and scholars of both gender studies, politics, and international relations. Its analysis of what has been achieved by feminist governance across diverse institutional contexts will also assist the work of feminist activists and practitioners of gender equality, both inside and outside the government. This handbook is very fortunate to be launched by our two esteemed guests in true feminist fashion of collaboration and shared leadership, and whose careers embody feminist governance. Each of our guests will say a few words, followed by a response from one of our editors, Professor Emeritus Marian Sawer. After this, we will then have a brief Q&A, and end the book launch with a reception outside. So let me begin first with Virginia Haussegger AM, a journalist and gender equity advocate whose extensive media career spans 3 decades across public and commercial broadcasting. Virginia presented ABC TV News in Canberra from 2001 to 2016, as well as previously reporting for current affairs programs, including the 7:30 Report. She has also been a regular newspaper columnist and author of the book Wonder Woman. She was appointed as an adjunct professor at the University of Canberra, where she became the founding director of the 50/50 by 2030 Foundation. She also established BroadAgenda, a news media platform developed to build a bridge between academic gender research and mainstream media. Among her many achievements, she serves on numerous boards and committees and became the ACT's Australian of the Year for 2019. Please all join me in warmly welcoming Virginia to the podium.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you very, very much for that very warm, long introduction. I always feel exhausted when I hear it. I want to thank Marian for the invitation to participate in the launch of this outstanding collection. And my congratulations to the editors who conceived and brainstormed and driven this almighty project. And that it is. To Marian, Jacqui, Leanne, and Johanna. The Handbook of Feminist Governance is, frankly, I believe, a remarkable feat. If you haven't seen it, this is it. It is immensely valuable and an important addition to the canon of feminist scholarship. And it has arrived at a critical juncture, right when democratic backsliding, the democratic backsliding we're seeing around the globe, is directly linked to a concerted, organised attack on gender equality and women's rights. And here in Australia, we are unfortunately far from immune from that increasingly vicious attack. And goodness me, anyone that happened to be in Sydney over the weekend and anywhere close to St Mary's Cathedral after Mass and happened to witness those appalling scenes and the anti-abortion rallies would know what I mean. It is extraordinary to think that here we are yet again having those kind of debates. And unfortunately, the beefed up thugs, believe me, they were thugs, with rosary beads around their necks, screaming at women who were trying to be heard. It was really quite an extraordinary and depressing thing to see. Now, when Natasha and I shared a brief exchange yesterday about how we'd approach this event, we sort of fell into her doing the launchy bit and I would do the worry bit. Because I feel like I'm doing a lot of worrying about feminism right now. But in truth, I think we probably spent more time talking about our need for a glass of wine. When I first began working through this handbook, I was reminded of an interview I did with Chanel Contos, the young sex education campaigner, who hit media headlines back in early 2021. When asking Chanel how she managed to stir a national conversation around consent and bring about a major reform in education policy within just 12 months. A reform, mind you, that involved getting the Federal Education Minister and every state and territory education minister sitting around a table and agreeing to rewrite the curriculum for sex education in schools in order to embed principles of equity and rights and teach girls and boys about consent and respect. In order to do that, which I think is quite an extraordinary feat for a woman who at the time was 22 or 23 years old, I asked her how she did it and she said, "Oh, Virginia, you just got to remember, it all happened by accident." As this handbook so powerfully illustrates, major social reform around gender equality does not happen by accident. It's a slow, methodical, calculated build. The pathway to reform is paved with hundreds, indeed thousands of carefully laid bricks all along the way. Getting to a point in time where those holding political power who have their hands on the policy levers understand immediately, with very little prompt, that something seemingly as basic as sex education in schools is in fact a vital tool for strengthening the principles of gender equality and embedding those among children. Well, to me, that echoes decades of action by women's movements here in Australia. Those in the seats of power are not sudden, benevolent feminists. They have been primed for decades. As said right at the front in the introduction to this handbook, for the past 50 years, women's movements have been inventing new ways of organising, institution building and disseminating gender equality norms. This collection is weighty with the success of those efforts. As I dived in to explore the handbook, I initially skipped the timeline because I thought I knew it all. But when some of the reading drew me back to the timeline, suddenly the penny really dropped. Those bricks of reform, those global, transformational, feminist reforms started falling into place. The slow, deliberate, structured build towards mainstreaming gender equality, the institutionalisation of equity principles and machinery to drive this has, of course, been a work in progress for at least 150 years, particularly if we go back to the very first International Congress of Women in 1878. I was 10 years old when the UN declared 1975 to 85 the Decade of Women, which kicked off with the International Year of Women. And young as I was at 10, I'd like to say I was 2, but I was 10, I picked up on the scent of excitement. I could feel it around me, I could feel it. I went to a pretty progressive primary school at the time, and I could feel it there. Not only did Miss Lidget in grade 5 stop wearing a bra, but I felt a distinct buzz about women's rights from the groovy teachers around me, and even the nuns I then later had in secondary school. The powerful norm-setting agenda of the UN back then worked on me. I felt the world was changing, and it was women doing the work. The sheer scale and transformative impact of feminist effort is reflected throughout this handbook, in every article, across every page. But you know, when looking at the depth and breadth of what proponents and architects of feminist governance have achieved, as well as considering what is now under threat of being dismantled, I found myself often shaking my head whilst going through the book and wondering why. Why is it that women have to do all of this work? Why is it that women have to spend our lives, your lives, generations of lives, fixing systems that are constructed around female exclusion, to shut women out, to minimise their participation and annul women's power? Once, when I was arguing against the lack of career opportunities for women in the commercial television station I worked at, and was arguing this issue with my boss, my senior boss, I was told in no uncertain terms that I just needed to learn to understand that the way things work was the natural order of things. Those were the words he used. This is the natural order of things, Virginia. In the chapter on national women's machineries, Trojan horses or hostages, I note the author's reflection that some bureaucracies have been so highly effective at mainstreaming gender that they've got to the point that feminist governance is becoming routine. Now, this we know to be true. However, the author goes on to say, in more autocratic settings, democrats have been displaced or isolated and are fighting to safeguard their gains. This we also know to be true. And this is what worries me most. Whilst beavering away, building the scaffold of feminist governance, smoothing the edges, tightening the joints, my concern is we have not fully turned our attention to how we respond to the pandemic of viral disinformation and gender hatred fermenting around us right now and around the globe. So pervasive is this attack that it can quickly, easily wipe out decades of hard, thoughtful, careful work that have built feminist governance into our organising and law-making institutions. The truth is, it can be wiped out in a blink. While feminist governance has built institutional structures, that very scaffolding is in fact precarious. Precarious against the brute power of fascist totalitarianism, theocracies, populist megalomaniacs, and hateful anti-women regimes. We've seen it in Afghanistan, Iran. But it doesn't only take brutal regimes to smash down feminist governance. We saw it with the stroke of a pen in the Oval Office that rearranged the seats at the Supreme Court in the US that has today led to the threat of young women being imprisoned for seeking an abortion. We've also seen it through a conservative uprising that cunningly uses the very language of equity, diversity and inclusion, in fact, to dismantle the achievements of feminist governance. As we heard from Sweden's new right-wing foreign minister, the minute he was sworn in last October, the very first thing he did was kill off Sweden's feminist foreign policy. Sweden, the shining light, the first government in the world to boldly proclaim a feminist foreign policy that others were trying to emulate. And here he was, killing it in just a matter of words, saying it's over. It's just a label, he said, and for Sweden it's the wrong label. And I quote, he said, "Gender equality is a fundamental value in Sweden and also for this government." However, he went on to say that Sweden's foreign policy must first and foremost reflect Swedish values and Swedish interests, which seem to be inferring that those Swedish values and interests are in contrast or indeed in tension with feminist values and feminist interests. This does not bode well for feminism or the progress of feminist governance. Back in 2014, we had a distinguished visitor here to ANU, Phumzile Mlambo-Nyaka, who had just been made the Executive Director, or announced the Executive Director of UN Women. And I was on the board of UN Women at the time, UN Women National Committee Australia. And we were considered to be one of the standout national committees among the 19 around the globe. And Phumzile very, very kindly made her very first international trip here to Australia and directly here to Canberra. So we held a big event for her where I interviewed her in front of hundreds of people here at ANU. And of course, what I wanted to ask her about most of all, when you think about it, was 2014, a year before Beijing Plus 20. Beijing, the declaration that the gender equality blueprint for the globe, and we were just about to hit the 20th anniversary, and I was very excited to know what we were going to do to celebrate that, to reopen it, to re-engage with it, to talk about it. And I'm going to tell you, I was really shocked at Phumzile's response. And in fact, in the audience on the night, I think there were a number of women, and I can see some of you nodding, there were a number of women who had actually been part of the Australian delegation in Beijing at the time. And as you know, that delegation, of course, was led by Carmen Lawrence. And as you would probably know, the Australians were very instrumental in the drafting of the Beijing Declaration for Gender Equality. And so we were pretty excited to hear what Phumzile was going to say about this. And to my shock and horror, and I won't go through all her words, but she said, when I asked her how this would be marked, Beijing Plus 20, she said, well, we won't be celebrating it. We won't be opening up that document for review. And I do quote from Phumzile when she said, if we are to convene in the same way that we did in Beijing, then we would lose the progress we gained. She said, we do not want to risk a forum that would reopen it. What she was specifically talking about, referring to, was the wind back of sexual and reproductive rights of women, and how she knew there were a number of member states of the UN right then who would have done everything to wind back the gains, particularly around those issues and rights that have been enshrined in the Beijing Declaration. I later on wrote a piece for the ABC on this the following year to actually make the point that we weren't celebrating or marking Beijing Plus 20, and I interviewed Karen Lawrence about it, and I told her what Ursula had said, and she was quiet for a moment, and then she just said, "That's terrible, that's worse than I thought." So, whilst we didn't have a big Australian celebration around Beijing Plus 20, Quentin Rice and I did jet off to Perth because there was a small celebration held over there, which was actually quite profound and beautiful one. But in particular, the Perth organisers had managed to get Gertrude Mongella, who was the Deputy UN General Secretary for the Fourth World Conference on Women at the time. So she led Beijing, and she came to the Perth conference and spoke, and she was quite elderly at this stage, but I'll never forget her words, because I recalled her words at Beijing actually in 1995, when she had said, the eyes of the world are on us. The eyes of the world are on us. So here she was 20 years later in Perth, Australia, and when I asked her about this, she said, she looked around the auditorium and said, "Well, have you all been doing your homework?" Which seemed like a funny thing to say, but what she was getting at is it was up to us to do the work, and then she went on to say there is still much homework that is yet to be done, yet to be handed in. So it was subtle, but the message was very clear. In conclusion, and I'll hand over to Natasha in a moment, but in conclusion, I think that this handbook, there are two critical things that it does, certainly for me. It lays out the work that has been done. It captures it, and that is very important because it keeps it in our mind's eye. I, again, used to have a boss in television news, the ABC, used to always say, if something isn't captured on video, it didn't happen. And in a sense, it's true. If we have the pictures, it didn't happen. This book reminded me of that line, because if this material, these arguments, these questions raised, and the evidence of what has been achieved hadn't been captured in this way, I fear that proof of its existence may have dissipated. So I'm so grateful that Marian and co-editors have done what they've done. And I know this is an enormous, enormous feat. In a sense, just like capturing the pictures makes or proves the story an event happened, every essay, every chapter in this book is providing those pictures, reminding us of what has been done. It shows us how the bricks in the past towards gender equality are laid. And in doing so, the Handbook of Feminist Governance also shows us what is still possible. And for that, I absolutely celebrate it and commend you for making it happen now. Now over to Natasha.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Let me now introduce our next guest speaker, and I'll be instructed to be very brief. Natasha Stottlisvoa AO is a professor in practice of politics at the ANU and a former senator, party leader, and ambassador. She has many achievements, and I'm sure a lot of us are very aware. But most relevant to the handbook is that she's a member of the UN Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and she was elected in 2020. I would like now to call on Natasha to say a few words as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that abridged introduction. I appreciate it, and I suspect the audience does too. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're speaking tonight, Ngunnawal people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and particularly want to acknowledge the role of First Nations women in bringing us to this significant week where we are looking at the referendum outline for the voice It was a great privilege to serve on the Prime Minister's Referendum Council all those years ago and watch the painstaking work and collaboration that went into the Uluru Statement from the heart. I know many of you feel that same solidarity and support, but gosh, I implore our fellow citizens to vote yes. I acknowledge other people, Emeritus Professor, my feisty friend and colleague, Virginia, all the contributors, of course the editors. You're an incredibly clever bunch, and it's a great honour to be a part of this historic opportunity today as we not only celebrate some of the regions, in fact the world, but also some of our own preeminent scholars, but also celebrate this comprehensive time that shows the extent to which, and I quote, feminist values and practices have been introduced into governance over the last 50 years. When the editors describe this book as comprehensive, they're not kidding. It's like a major parts detail theoretical perspectives, evolving institutions, international relations, and global governance, the EU and feminist governance, as well as other regional perspectives. It's not only a compendium and an analysis, as you've heard, of feminist governance, rather than the agenda of governance in all spheres. It offers us practical work and practical ideas for future research. And I want to emphasise the practical because, thank you, Leah, not only for your contribution, but when you talk about me as a professor in the practice of politics, when a male academic acquaintance said that, he said, oh God, not another fake professor. And what he missed was in the practice. So you've done this wonderful, extraordinary, scholarly work. But for me tonight, I'm grateful to be a part of a launch that dovetails with my experience and passion in politics and indeed, yes, the international sphere now, but also combines it with my, lifelong love of the F word, feminism. The timing is perfect. Certainly, I've just come back from the most recent CEDAW session, the 84th session, during which we're conscious of all the things that Virginia's just brilliantly articulated. We're not just looking at countries that have been slow to progress or advance gender equality. We're actually dealing with countries, confronted by countries that are actively backsliding. So everything you've said, Virginia, I'm so conscious that this backlash is omnipresent, it is real. And you mentioned or alluded to, even in recent weeks, some of the things we've seen. In addition to what we've seen in Afghanistan anyway, in the last week or so, women denied contraception. We know that women are being forced back to violent ex-husbands. We've seen girls in Iran poisoned for going to school. And as you mentioned also, 24 Republicans initially co-sponsoring legislation that would see women face the death penalty for having an abortion. But take heart, Dr. Sawer, Professor Sawer has given us fighting words. She says, to resist erosion and loss, a first step is to increase awareness of what has been achieved and not just its limitation. That is what this handbook does. The positive outtake, as the authors state, is increasingly government bureaucracies, parliaments and international organisations are adopting feminist principles and promoting the norms of gender equality, applying a gender lens to policies and consulting with diverse communities of women. I note the handbook explains that the term feminist governance covers all the processes of government, from informal to formal, including relationships through which authority is both exercised and held to account. But Erica Townsend-Bell, yes, reminds us that feminist governance is a concept in formation and its basic elements are agreed upon. But she also says, in her chapter, Seeking Intersectionality in Feminist Governance, she suggests feminist governance still has some way to go in connecting the gender equality mission with the insights of intersectionality. Similarly, Jan Sarah Louis argues feminist governance researchers need to incorporate intersectionality as a form of critical inquiry that can be a powerful tool in dismantling hegemony. You've heard from Virginia about the timeline. Renee O'Shannessy, thank you. It is a helpful timeline, but also I was going to outline some of the dates, but I think you've done that brilliantly. Its use is not only to remind us what's gone before, but yes, give us a sense of just how impressive so many of the achievements are, including in that decade to which you referred, Virginia, that decade in which so many international, global advances took place, including the establishment of the Convention for the Committee, of which I'm now a member. Marian, when she was worried that I didn't have a hard copy of the book, was kind enough to send me some select chapters, in addition to the huge digital sort of tome. And I must admit, even though they captured my attention, some predictable ones given my background, I couldn't help but go through this entire handbook and was captured by everything from, yes, the national women's machineries, that section on, yes, Trojan horses or hostages, you know, in which Anne-Marie Gertz concludes, far from being unnecessary for feminist governance, they may well prove to be its anchors. Or whether or not gender-sensitive budgeting, including the history of gender-sensitive budgeting in our country. And of course, some of us well remember 1996, that decision by former Prime Minister to effectively dismantle that machinery. And then there's the discussion around the role of the UN Security Council and how it needs to fulfil the feminist principle of transferring and sharing power. The list goes on. Examinations on feminist governance, from climate change to global health, and countries and regions ranging from obviously Latin America to the Pacific Islands to Asia, the EU. You can see the breadth of this document. And yes, you're right, Marian, I was a bit attracted to the section, the chapter on feminist foreign policy, which Virginia has also talked about, because it is an exciting development, and one of which the former Swedish Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, who pioneered it in 2014, would be proud. But the authors, Karen Agastan and Jacqui remind us, feminist foreign policy has emerged through the advocacy of feminist actors in governments, but in conjunction with their allies outside. And we see this happening in Australia at the moment, not just with the authors of that chapter, but Dr. Elise Stevenson, you know, and Sue Harris-Rimmer, who are all campaigning for this. And I know that the authors cite the former Foreign Minister of Australia, Julie Bishop, who effectively, quote, according to them, raised the bar when she insisted that not 50%, but 8% of Australia's international development budget had to effectively address gender equality in its implementation. And that has made a difference. And I'm sure there'll be many views as to how successful that has been. But I saw the difference as Ambassador for Women and Girls, not just in the resources and the funds provided, but the cultural change in missions and embassies around the world when they understood that this was a part of the mantra. In those days, as Ambassador for Women and Girls, there was only a handful of us. Seychelles, the US, Australia, Sweden, overachievers, and Finland. Oh, seriously, I used to get title envy every time my Swedish counterpart would come in and say, hi, I'm Ambassador for Feminist Foreign Policy. I'm like, I've got women and girls. And it's interesting because the book talks about formal and informal networks in relation to feminist foreign policy and feminist foreign policy governance. Talking about Madeleine Albright's network of women world leaders, right through to Sam Power's work today, and other organisations, including informal networks of ambassadors. So I was thinking about, yes, the work that we've done as a small but passionate posse, as we tried to encourage other countries to establish comparable positions, such as Canada. And it's got me wondering, you know, I'm wondering if there is a special place in hell for female ambassadors who don't support other female ambassadors. I don't know. There are many other areas in this handbook, including, of course, politics, whether it's in relation to gender-sensitive parliaments or specialised parliamentary bodies. They consolidate those chapters, some of the groundbreaking work that has been done in Australia and globally. Sonia Palmari, thank you for your efforts. When you and your co-author, Sarah Childs, declare in your chapter that you've got a personal and professional investment, you're not kidding either. The contribution that you have made to making or creating a roadmap for more gender-sensitive parliaments and institutions that actually value gender equality can't be underestimated, and I take my hat off to you. Of course, we've still got a way to go. When a fifth of Australians still believe that men make better leaders because they're less emotional and more rational than we are. Obviously, we've got work to do. By the way, that's not exactly been my experience. But don't get me wrong, nor do I want men to be unemotional and confined by rigid gender stereotypes as well. I do acknowledge, though, we've made some extraordinary progress in recent times, and I take heart in changes in Parliament federally, 4% now of our Parliament Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, got more women than ever before, 53% in the Senate, always knew the real action was in the red leather benches, and more diverse backgrounds reflected and represented. And it's interesting looking at the chapter Promoting Gender Equality in Elected Office. Mona Lynn Crook and Pippa Norris talk about the importance of quotas, but make it clear that they're not the be-all and end-all. And I understand that, but I also know that quotas work. And Lucy and I have just come back from a CEGOR session in which we saw exactly what you were illustrating. Things can change fast. In 2016, Tunisia introduced a gender parity law. And in those elections, municipal elections where it applied, 47%, so roughly half of those successful candidates were women. What happened last year? The president got rid of the gender parity law. And the last federal election saw 3% of voters were women and 15% of successful candidates were female. We know that quotas have an impact, and you only have to look at our parliament to see the changes to that are largely as a consequence, of course, of the efforts across each parties and non-mainstream parties, but also one major party introducing quotas. I want to say that some of the best examples I saw of progressive policy during my time in office were when women worked together in cross-party collaboration, whether that was on transparency in pregnancy counselling, advertising, or indeed RU486. And as we know, there is still a link between efforts to redress violence against women and more women in positions of power. And the chapter on violence against women, which the authors argue is a fascinating field to look at from the point of feminist governance, well, I couldn't agree more. They refer to the fact that the CEGOR Convention didn't actually talk about violence as a form of discrimination against women. But we've, of course, redressed that over years with general recommendations such as GR 19 in 1992. So we've addressed the issue of violence under Article 5, as some of you know. But I say that it's particularly relevant at the moment, as some of you will be aware. There's a global push for a new treaty, a comprehensive treaty, which is not uncontroversial, with a mix of interesting proponents and advocates. And yet again, shows us there is a risk potentially of watering down the good work that has been done. The authors believe that the pushback against the Istanbul Convention, for example, makes clear, quote, that the issue of violence against women, despite the advances in international legislation, remains contested. They conclude, feminist activism remains vital to uphold and advance violence against women policies in the national and international realm. Well, I can assure you some of us are wedded to that activism and will continue to push hard internationally as well. Dr. Sawer, you've identified the Beijing Declaration as the high point for feminist organisation, but also the point at which opposition stepped up. I note that the Secretary General for the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said on International Women's Day that it's going to take 300 years at least to effectively achieve gender equality at this pace. He also said the patriarchy is fighting back. Well, I'd like to think that this handbook not only gives us the literature and the fuel, but the inspiration to counter this and keep going. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Virginia and Natasha. May I now call both of you to the podium to officially and jointly,
Yes.
it has to be said, to launch the book.
Just because it's collaborative doesn't make it easy, does it? Like, what could possibly go wrong?
How correct you are, though, that so many of those good things have happened because of collaboration, and we saw that when you were in Parliament time and time again. What an honour it is to be involved in the launch of this extraordinary piece. It's more than a piece of work. It is a feat.
It's a piece of work, it's huge.
Yes, not exactly a handbook that you pop into your purse, is it? No, it is an extraordinary achievement, and my goodness me, as I think we've both touched on, how critically timely it is.
So we hereby?
You can hereby, you go for it.
No, it has to be done like together. This is, you know, we're job sharing. It's great.
We are.
Yeah.
So we haven't practiced these words.
No. We'll declare.
I think we declare this book, Magnificent Feminist Governance Handbook,
officially launched.
you so much. And now we move on to a response from one of the editors. I would like to call on Emeritus Professor Marian Sawer, one of the Handbook's editors, to say a few words. As many of you are familiar, Professor Sawer also has had a long and illustrious list of intellectual contributions to the study of gender and political science. This is evident, of course, in that she was made an Officer of the Order of Australia in 1994 for services to women and to political science. She has also been elected Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. And as, again, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with her work. Look up her website and you will see a long list. And indeed, one of that is the handbook that we are launching today. So, Professor Sawer, please join us in the podium for a few words. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, well, I've got to start, of course, with some thank yous. First of all, thank you to our stars who have done the most generous launch today and also embodied the collaborative approach to leadership, which we discuss in this handbook. And I think we've got some small, very small presents, token of our appreciation. Thank you, Tamara.
How exciting. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so many thanks to the stars of the day, but also great thanks to the Gender Institute for hosting this. Thanks to Fiona Jenkins, who unfortunately is in Japan today, but did preparatory work on this, and great thanks to Marian Sawer, who's been putting together today's event. So thank you to the Gender Institute. Now, I must remember next to thank my co-editors, Ann Banaszak at Penn State, Jacqui at Monash, and Johanna Kantola at University of Helsinki. It was a bit of a trial having editorial meetings by Zoom, considering the drastic difference in time zones represented amongst the co-editors of this handbook. But we persisted, and the reason we persisted was because we did think it was important to get this handbook out. It reflects the way that feminist scholarship is done in collaboration with feminist practitioners. It's a co-production of knowledge which is reflected in this handbook, and so a partnership between practitioners and scholars, but of course many combine these roles, and notably Sonia Palmieri, who we've already heard referred to, has combined brilliantly the roles of practitioner and scholar, and is a co-author of two of the chapters in this handbook, including a very original chapter on feminist norm work in international and regional institutions. That feminist norm work providing the handbooks, the toolkits, the guidelines, the benchmarking for operationalising gender equality frameworks. So thank you Sonia for your contribution. And so more thanks. Who's next? So that's co-authors, authors, practitioners. I think I'll stop there with the circle of thanks, but of course it could be extended much further. But why did we do this now? We've already heard some of the reasons why it had to be done now, or why we thought it had to be done now. Often, when we're engaged in trying to push forward feminist knowledge production and feminist practice, we're kind of very aware of the flaws in what's been done so far, and what a long way there still is to travel. This means, or can mean, that we overlook the extent of the feminist contribution to governance which has taken place since the 1970s. As we've heard, feminist contributions to governance rushed around the world and in an unprecedented way. Today, 192 countries have some form of government machinery to promote gender equality, or the status of women and girls, as some still prefer to call it. So every member of the UN system, except North Korea, now has gender equality machinery. So these things have happened, but as we've already heard, things can go backwards very quickly. We've had the example of the Swedish feminist foreign policy, which, when a new government was elected last year with the backing of a radical right populist party, it promptly abandoned feminist foreign policy. So these threats are very real, not just the issue of neoliberal economic paradigms, which has been a problem for feminist governance since at least the 1980s, and I'll maybe talk a bit more about that later. But there's also, of course, organised religious conservatism, organised transnationally, and the group of Friends of the Family have been very active and growing within the UN system to contest the gains of feminist governance. And we have the rise of radical right populism, which we've already heard a bit about. So we felt it was really important to raise awareness of what had been done in terms of feminist contributions to governance, so that we can hold on to it, or try to hold on to it, rather than losing it in a fit of absence of mind. But keep an eye on what's happening. So the handbook itself is expensive. Hopefully everybody's library will acquire it. But these are the free bits. So you can get here the introduction and the invaluable timeline you've already heard referred to. So which shows feminist governance spreading through, mediated through international and regional institutions of governance. So I do commend the free bits, and hopefully you will also be able to access the full handbook. So I think that's all I need to say for the moment, and of course Maria has combined brilliantly the roles of Deputy Convener of the Gender Institute and esteemed author in the handbook. Thank you, Maria.